The Myths of Family was recorded live in New York City by Steve Stein, and this is James Hillman, by the way, talking already, and this is part one of the Myths of Family. And nowhere are we more living our myths than in the reality of home life, as you're about to hear. And good luck as you listen. The piece this evening has been really written for a psychologically interested public rather than professionals. And the topic and the target is broad. It's really for the fact that we're all in psychology, whether we like it or not. We live in a psychological age, and everything is about psychology wherever you turn if it's not about economics. So it serves really to open into a basic attitude of mine that shows all through my work more recently, which is the broadening of depth psychology towards issues of the culture. And this, so it has as one of its intentions to undermine and to act subversively, which is what depth psychology did from the very beginning, to undermine and act subversively upon professional psychology. Its techniques, its jargon, its cultishness, and particularly the fetish that dominates, or at the altar of which professional therapeutic psychology worships today, which is the family, especially childhood. Now, this is a deadly heavy subject, family. A very serious indeed for psychology, since it's the main line of our work. We mainline on family. We live on it, we're addicted to it, and we can't throw it off. And we continue depending on family. I'm talking about psychology. We continue depending on family for our theoretical accounts and our practical work, even though today the statistics are all against us. As you know, except for us in this room, who are sort of nice white people, there are no families. The nuclear normal family departures rather from the nuclear normal family is now 75% of the American population. Someone else told me after I said this once that 94% of the families are dysfunctional. Persons living alone count for 1/4 of all households. At least 15% of women in their 20s and 30s will remain childless, which is almost twice the former rate, of, let's say, 30 years ago. 1 out of every 5 children born now was born to an unmarried mother. 1 out of 5, and that's increasing. The U.S. divorce rate is the highest in the world, and 50% of marriages made this year, 50% of marriages made this year will probably end in divorce. That's every other marriage. Anyone going to get married? 1/3 of those treated for mental disorders in hospitals are teenagers. 1/3 of those treated in hospitals for mental disorders are teenagers. 3 out of every 100 adult males in the USA are in the correction system. That's 3% of the adult males in the United States are either in penitentiary or jail or in probation or on parole. 3 out of 5 children born this year will live in a single-parent household, at least for part of their childhood. And as for parents, 44% of the children in the state of Virginia, according to one of these marvelous surveys, prefer their TV sets to their fathers. Although they do prefer their mothers to their TVs. The family home is the most dangerous place to be in the USA. That because statistics of homicides, say that one is more likely to be killed by a relative or by someone you know or someone already in the family than anywhere else or by anyone else. So Now, despite all this falling apart, the fantasy of the family holds and holds us fast. And it is a fantasy. Ronnie Lang said already in 1971 that the family system is to be understood from the interiority of the family as fantasy, that it is a fantasy experience. The members, there is no objective set of relations. There is a fantasy of a family going on in each person in what's called a family. So already he was, in his book, The Politics of the Family, was beginning to deliteralize family by saying that. And I think that's one of the things I want to do this weekend, is expand the idea of it. And this talk this evening is called From Entrapment to Embrace, how to move our sense of being entrapped in a family pattern into embracing it, or being in the embrace of it. So let's begin with that. Believing himself dying of monoxide poisoning in his hut near the South Pole, Admiral Richard E. Byrd penciled a last note as a last act of his life, believing he was going to die, a message to his wife, one to his children, and another to his mother. This is all recounted in his this ordeal is recounted in his book called Alone, which was published a few years later when Byrd was. He wrote then, that is, he was absolutely in his hut, believing himself dying, unable to move, at the South Pole. This is in the 30s. And he wrote, "At the end, only two things really matter to a man, regardless of who he is, and they are the affection and understanding of his family. Anything and everything else he creates are insubstantial, but the family is an everlasting anchorage." Now, I feel the Admiral was not expressing only the sentiments of his 1930s upper-middle-class Virginian culture, nor do I believe this faith in family as supreme value was only the necessary accompaniment of the heroic style. The hero, immersed in an epic, as was Byrd in this polar night at death's edge, locates himself inside a myth, in this case, the ancestral line of the family myth. But beyond both the bourgeois and the heroic is the primordial metaphor of family itself. We're born into a family, and at the last we rejoin its full extension when gathered to the ancestors. Family grave, family altar, family trust, family secrets, family pride. A death in the family is often where we first meet death. And we are made from the imaginations of our families, not just from the genes or the bodies of our families. We're made from the imaginations of our families. Our names are family names, our physiognomies bear family traits, and our dreams never let us depart from home, father and mother, brother and sister, from those faces and those rooms. Even alone and only ourselves, we are also always part of them and partly them. There seems to be no escape from the fate of family, and it is this amor fati, as the Romans called love of fate, that Admiral Byrd recognized at the very end of his life, turning the entrapment in the shelter that he believed would be his tomb into the quiet harbor of family. You see, the family came up in his mind as the sheltering, nourishing place in which he could die. So he turned the vice of no way out into a foundational virtue. And that's what I'd like to do this evening, is turn the vice of entrapment in the personal family into an archetypal recognition of family, archetypal recognition of family as the supreme metaphor for sustaining the human condition, whether you have a family or not. Now, where does family fit in the modern myth of individual independence? That myth says home is what you leave behind. Moving on means moving out. Admiral Byrd's anchor feels to many like an albatross. Family, so goes the developmental tale, and we all studied our developmental psychology, and we all believe in development. Family's only the beginning, a necessary evil, which, like all beginnings, must be left behind. An adult has grown up, declared his independence, and his life and liberty are dedicated to the pursuit of his own happiness. In the United States, a newborn infant is believed to be so symbiotically fused with its mother that every effort must be made to develop its ability to separate, to stand on its own as early as it can. In Japan, a newborn infant is believed to be so utterly alien, descended from some strange other place, that every effort must be made to enfold it within the human community as early as possible. Two opposed trajectories of development. Neither is right or wrong. Both are living myths. Myths because they are lived unconsciously and collectively as truths, performed unwaveringly as rituals, stuffed with emotion, and having long-term consequences. Now, psychoanalysis has swallowed whole the myth of individual development away from family. Everyone who buys an hour of analysis buys into this myth called strengthening the ego. The first steps of any current treatment in mental hygiene, brainwashing, uncovers the family romance, as it is called, which in the widest sense refers to the damaging fantasies arising from an individual's relations within the family. Notice here the focus on the heroic ego. The family represents merely the limits imposed by genetic nature or environmental nurture, a restrictive influence on personal growth. A restrictive influence on personal growth. Now, other cultures would not imagine the individual over and against the family. Where other cultural myths dominate, an individual is always perceived as a family member. Our myth, however, insists that ego is strengthened and full personality achieved away from familial ties and pressures. Moving out means literally moving out. Leaving the family means that family becomes the left out, the left behind, that is, the rejected and repressed. So the importance of family is a byproduct of the importance we give to the independent, isolated, heroic ego. And then the projected, the area behind the door filled with demons and which cannot change because, as Freud said, what is repressed goes through no alterations with time. Not family is the problem, but our mythology called psychological development. That is the problem. Psychology has even invented secondary embellishments to make its myth of individual independence more compelling. Otherwise, a person might naively suppose that family pulls and pressures are what other cultures regard as filial bonds, kinship love, family pride, parental sacrifice. That's what it's called in other cultures. Therefore, psychology has discovered an entire demonology within family. Byrd's safe harbor is mined with the irremediable envy of sibling rivalry between brothers and sisters, castration threats by fathers, disguised cannibalism by sons, devouring mothers, schizogenic mothers, as well as an omnipotent, amoral, polymorphous, perverse child. All that's in the family. Besides, of course, all the new ones that have now appeared, the molesters, abusers, violators, and so on. These are only some of the sucking monsters in family life. Of course, therefore, maturing, coping, and handling have come to mean freedom from family. And of course, therapy finds itself justified to go right into the home, to exercise by means of family therapy the creatures which its myth has identified, if not created. Is it too much to assert that the most devastating effect of Western psychology is neither the reductive sexualization of the mind, nor the pseudo-religion of self-centeredness, but rather its deliberate rupture of the great chain of generations, which it has accomplished by means of its myth of individual development toward independence? You know, at the Eleusinian Mysteries in Greece, there were 3 injunctions. One was, honor thy parents. The second was, honor the gods with fruits. And the third was, spare the animals. Now we have begun to pick up the third one, spare the animals. We may get to honor the gods with fruits, but I don't think we're going to get to honor thy parents. A Jewish joke says this best. You probably all know it. To tell a Jewish joke in New York is a very risky thing, but... Three mothers from New York, retired in Miami Beach, are comparing the love of their sons. Everybody knows it already? That's the trouble in New York, you see. The first says, you know my car, the Jaguar? So who paid for it? My son. The second says, you've been to my apartment? You saw the Chagall on the wall? Who bought it on Madison Avenue and schlepped it down here? My son. The third mother says, my son goes to a psychiatrist on Park Avenue 4 times a week. And now the 4th year. $120 an hour. And what do they talk about? Me. Now, psychology's demolition of the family, whether by uncovering vipers in the bosom of its love or by urging independent individualism, succeeded at least in demolishing the bourgeois sentimental fantasy of family, which had, in fact, mastered children, oppressed wives and sisters, and kept men enslaved to their repressions. Pious attempts to restore the Norman Rockwell tousled and freckled family portrait have fallen to the incredible statistics of abused and molested children, battered wives, and infirm seniors brutalized by their own kith and kin. That paradigm of family, more German even than Anglo-Saxon, ensuring church attendance, child discipline, and ethical culture, and orderly home-cooked bürgerlich meals, was called Kirche, Kinder, Küche once, exists only as a fundamentalist, maybe Republican nostalgia for the 19th century. The family is a big shibboleth of a certain segment of the political spectrum. The overwrought, exhausting difficulties that consume family life indicate that something important is going on there. Any big emotion signals value. Any big emotion signals value. It doesn't signal something's wrong, it signals value. The task is to discover the gold in the volcano. So let's see what myth we can recover from some typically emotional moments in family life. Well, one is false identity. During childhood, traits of personality are identified, and one's identity begins to form partly in accordance with the, I was going to say perceptions of others, but it's the fantasy of others. It's hard to tell the fantasy and the perception. Jilly's a real tomboy, a string bean who only has time for animals. Will Jilly ever marry? Will Jilly become a lesbian or a veterinarian? Billy can't keep out of trouble. I can't trust him out of my sight. Will Billy ever hold down a decent job? Might he end up in prison? Millie was the quietest baby, always smiling and such a charmer. Will Millie stay home with her parents, keeping them happy, or get pregnant at 15? From these sorts of family fantasies, 2 contradictory cliches emerge, and therapy uses both of them. No one knows you better than your family. My family can't see me at all. The division of goods between Jilly, Billy, and Millie keeps them in family-determined roles that seem as time goes on to be false identities. But discovering whether these perceptions are true or false, that illusion of finding a real identity independent of the family fantasy is far less rewarding than is the recognition that within the family a personal myth begins to take shape. The myth which forms one's identity. By identity here I mean identifiable reactions, habits, and styles. One finds oneself inside a myth, which is neither true or false, but simply the precondition for fitting one into the family drama as a recognizable character, playing usually the same parts and coming up with the same kinds of reactions. Now, if there are no pronounced family fantasies, the drama doesn't work, and we flounder about in that strangely loveless limbo which psychology calls an identity crisis. For family love expresses itself by means of these fantasies of what I want you to become, what I imagine about you, what I am proud of you for. These fantasies of identity show that someone is noticing traits and habits and styles. Whether a person lives into the myth or rebels against it, first there must be a myth. And there is always a myth. Example, I went to a huge Swiss anniversary family party some years ago in Zurich. There were 80 people there, and the different sons and daughters and relatives and so on gave speeches. One daughter saw her family as a long repression of the mother. This daughter stood up and made a speech. She was a feminist, and that was her anniversary speech. One saw the family as rife with sibling rivalry and the individual development of each member. He was a hero. An uncle told the story of the family rising from ineptitude and inertia to wealth. He told a capitalist Marxist story. I learned that this one and same family is a projective field like a primitive tribe to an anthropologist, like a patient, like babies and infants, a text which we interpret, on which the unconscious is projected, one's favorite myth is projected, and seen in the family as its story, its psychodynamics. You follow me there? We call that psychodynamics, but we're projecting, we're imagining it in terms of the fantasy structure by means of which we look at the family. Another part of family life are the relatives and the in-laws. Most lives are spent among likes, similar budgets, similar age spreads and gaps, similar tastes and vocabularies. The people whom we choose to be with do not truly force us beyond our usual psychological boundaries. In the family, however, just where you might expect to be with those most like you, you encounter instead a collection of the strangest folk. At any large family gathering, there come together the most extraordinary behaviors and most incompatible opinions, yet all this is in the same clan. Terence said, "Nothing human is alien to me." Relatives and in-laws provide the opportunity of extending our human understanding to what strikes us as alien. Where else or how else would one ever spend an evening with a man from Orange County who pays dues to the clan, or with a math professor who interprets signals from outer space, or a junkyard dealer who separates metals and who did time in the state pen, and the manners and the clothes and the bodies? This is the family. This is more alien than Terence may have imagined. This is downright outlandish and freakish. And here we realize that large family affairs, rather than being scenes of convention, are actually performances of highest comedy and outrageously funny, which also serves to encourage one's own peculiarities. It's one of the places where you can parade them. They already see you that way. For as an in-law and relative yourself, you too appear and are rather freakish to the others. Because a large family reception receives in magnificentia et gloria all the shadows, all the events, whether good news or bad news, associated with family members. And they're magnified and glorified, thereby extending the size of the family's heart. Isn't it strange how one wants to be accepted, taken in, recognized by family members? Very, very strange. You have no use for them, you don't even know them, you don't care about them, but you want them to perceive you, recognize, take you in some way. The measure of a family's magnanimity is not what it gives to charity, but rather its capacity to shelter the shadows of its members. Charity begins at home. We each feel this heart extending when, for instance, a little pride arises over the naming as the best insurance salesman in the county, a seemingly unremarkable young man who is nonetheless married to your niece. You suddenly think, this man won the Best Western desk service for the month of August. And it meant nothing to you till you found out he's married to your niece, and that makes him... The family carries all that for you. Studies in family, another chapter of where the emotions break out. Family meals. Studies in family disorders accuse the evening meal of being the major focus of household tension. Here at table, family fights over money, duties, politics, or morals are most likely to break out, and later eating patterns, the rhythms of chewing, swallowing, breathing, and talking. All that has to happen at once, you know, and it's very easy to get that thrown off. Chewing, swallowing, breathing, and talking. The intermissions between silence and noise, the very notion of what constitutes good food, all that takes on definitive form. Here, too, gross food disorders like anorexia and bulimia often appear first. Whether the atmosphere at meals be boisterous and competitive, or chaotic with phoning and TV, or gravely formalized, tension is always on the menu. Now, tension at the start of a meal belongs with the instinct of appetite. Just go to the zoo at feeding time and watch the animals pace and snarl, or ask a good Italian waiter about getting the prima, the first course, on the table quickly. The whole style in a good Italian restaurant is to get the prima there right away, and never mind the check. That comes slow and hours later. But the first course has got to get there quickly. Meals are meant to start fast and conclude in digestive leisure. Tension, therefore, belongs to the moment of sitting down at table, and not only for animal reasons. Tension arises as an unconscious, it's gone. Well, we'll make it up. It ended with the word unconscious, right? Here it is. Unconscious recognition of the sacramental nature of the family act. Grace overtly acknowledges the sacramental tension. And grace may be less to invoke a blessing than it is to ward off the demons. And so do all the many rituals that go with family meals. Fixed places, dinner on time, the rituals of clean hands, of setting places and clearing the table, and the endless attempts to mollify the tension with light music, dimmer lights, rules concerning what is appropriate to talk about at the table. All this elaborate etiquette, and every family will have some ritual. These forces are ready to explode civilized conventions at the most innocuous provocation. It's nobody's personal fault. This is what happens at the moment of the eating. Not only the animal tensions, but the archetypal forces, the demons that sit around the edge of the room and just wait for an opening. Maybe that's why we now have TV dinners and all the rest. We've given up even trying to do it. Another place of emotion, going back home. Whether from prison camp after a war or just taking the bus home for Thanksgiving, homecoming is fraught with dreadful anticipation. Opening the front door releases overwhelming emotions, also the side door, and also the counterforce of repression against those emotions that so often characterize the stifled atmosphere of returning. Here we must remember that going home is always going back home. Returning is essentially a regressive act in keeping with the essential function of the family. Regressive act in the sense that independence and moving out is the heroic thing. So we talk about going back home. A regressive act in keeping with the essential function of family to provide shelter for the regressive needs of the soul. Essential function of family to provide shelter for the regressive needs of the soul. Everyone needs a place to crawl and lick his wounds, a place to hide and be 12 years old, inept and needy. The bar, the bed, the boardroom, and the buddies do not meet the needs which always limp along behind the myth of independent individuality. See, that's something we tend to forget. We become independent and individual, but there's all that stuff that limps behind, the inept, needy part. Something always remains undeveloped, and this piece needs to go back home, as country and Western lyrics often enough affirm. Going back may mean sleeping till 2 in the afternoon, or taking refuge in the bathroom, or crying with mom in the kitchen, or just complaining, as do the grandparents who fall ill during every visit. Going home at whatever age offers going back, regression. And the fight against family during these return trips is therefore a displacement of the fight against regression. Say that one again. The fight against family during these return trips is therefore a displacement of the fight against regression. We don't want to admit the weakness in our characters and the hungers in our desires. We don't want to admit that we've not grown up, and so blame the family for both bringing out our worst and then for not indulging it enough. Meanwhile, that strange sense of consciousness ebbing away, going down the family drain. You just sit there and you can just feel everybody going down the drain. The debilitating energy loss strikes everyone alike as if a communal power outage. Everyone caught in repeating and resisting old patterns. Nothing changed after all these years. All this analysis, all this therapy, and I'm right where I was. No one can get out even for a walk to break the spell. The whole family sinking deeper into the upholstery. And TV has little to do with it and may even be in such moments the household god who saves. These moments attest to the capacity of family for sharing. French anthropology used to speak of a participation mystique, a mystical participation in a tribe, in a common soul or psychic state, and for containing the regressive needs of the soul. You know, no one is at fault, no one is kicked out, and no one can be helped. No one can be helped. In the paralysis lies the profoundest source of acceptance. See, we think acceptance has to do with fixing it or making it better or empathy or sympathy. Paralysis is the greatest empathy there is. You're just there with the other person. You can't do anything. There's no attempt to change anybody. At the end of the Oedipus Rex, at the very end, there's a sentence, "Take him in, blind Oedipus, take him in. It is most decent that only kin should see and hear the troubles of kin." So that's the way it goes. When nobody can do anything about it, Grandpa goes on grumbling, brother attacking the administration, sister introvertedly attending her eczema, and mother goes on covering up with solicitous busyness. Everyone goes down the drain because family love allows family pathology. An immense, inexpressed tolerance felt as hopelessness. For the hopeless shadow in each, the shadow that we each carry as permanent part of our baggage and which we unpack when we go home. Home is a place where rage, perversions, crying, craziness, dirt happens. Break things, lock yourself up, scream, crack windows, keep a gun cabinet, a porn closet, beat on someone, slam doors, gorge food, jerk off, sit on the toilet for 2 hours, become a derelict, obsess a hobby. That's what goes on at home. Now, these 5 bad moments, or 6 or 7, or as many as I've mentioned, are symptomatic of what lies at the root of family problems. Not the failure to relate, not the breakdown of the old patriarchal model, not even the incurably freakish, especially depressive pathologies that make their home at home, but rather the root lies in the archetypal nature of family itself. As an archetypal reality, the experience of family feels so often unreal because family is permeated through and through with eternal exaggerations, an impossible too-muchness, or mythic dimension, which is the stuff of the symptoms we suffer and also the stuff of much of our culture's stories, novels, and dramas. And this mythical exaggeration is at work in even the most conventionalized, urban, eat-and-run, unconnected, first-name parents, upward mobile, a-religious unit of consumers called family. Family is less a rational place than a mythical place. And the expectation of finding rational reality at home is precisely what makes us condemn it as unreal. We say, my family is unreal. Of course it's unreal, it's mythical. Attempts at business-like communication, reasonable discussion of problems, and structuring a new paradigm all overlook the fundamentals at the source of family life, the deep-seated and indestructible complexes of the psyche, once called demons, ghosts, and ancestors, whose place is in the home, and who continue to force home life into mythical proportions. Jung said the gods have become diseases. That's where the diseases are. The mythology is a study of pathology. Mythology is a study of pathology. Now I want to say something a little more about the idea, the word family, and where it comes from. This notorious nuclear family that we used to see in the Saturday Evening Post pictures, 2 parents, 2 siblings, a family car, and a pet, does not correspond with the Latin word from which family derives. This famous word is inseparable from the idea of land settlement. The Roman word familias, and I'm quoting now from a text on the roots of family in the Roman world from which our notion comes from, and is therefore essentially, family is therefore essentially the house itself with the persons living in it. It's the house itself with the persons living in it. It doesn't start with the persons. And thus the religion of the familia is a religion of practical utility, of daily work, of struggle with perils. It is not the worship of an idea of kinship. That's very, very different from our sense of who's in the family. But it's applicable to the kinds of families that we are beginning to live, where we live with different sorts of people in a household who may not be blood related. Familia, familias, to the Romans meant primarily a house and all belonging to it, a household establishment, family, servants, domestics, so on. Neither parentage nor descent, nor even blood kinship within the clan, for which the Romans had another word, gens, G-E-N-S, determined the use of the word family. Place did. By Romans here, I mean the entire civilized Western world and its language that lives on in our Latinate roots. Our Census Bureau says that any 2 people related by blood or marriage or adoption, one of whom is a householder, that's the crucial term. That consists in a family, according to the Census Bureau, at least in 1980. I don't know what they're doing now, but any 2 people related by blood or marriage or adoption, one of whom is a householder. So again, the old idea of being connected to a place or to a structure is where the root of the idea of family. Because a familia connoted a physical house and all belonging to it as goods, fortune, inheritance, the more accurate part of the fantasy of the American nuclear family may be the estate car and the household pet. In fact, a domesticated animal was considered often a familiar, living together in familiarity as a psychoeconomic organism. Psychoeconomic organism, such is the meaning of family. Even the Greek word oikonomia, from which economy and economics, means household management or keeping house. The family is a function of the house rather than vice versa, where house is the concrete container of multiple familiarities and multiple intimacies. The domesticated world of belongings, what belongs to us and to what we belong, and where belonging also means what is fitting, appropriate, and customary. Where belonging also means what is fitting, appropriate, and customary. This etymological background suggests a far broader sense of family, giving primary emphasis to the idea of mutually dependent psychic system under the same roof. Mutually dependent psychic system under the same roof, whether a farm, a kibbutz, or a condominium block. This broader sense includes the notions of service and participation, a membership investing in and benefiting from a larger household. See, it's not based on fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers and sons and daughters and all that. It's based on a psychoeconomic organism. Filial piety and brotherly love seem secondary to this family household. Yet this household does include all the things belonging to an estate, the animals, the goods, and the furnishings. Your family is your furniture in more than a metaphoric sense. And little wonder that there's such bitterness erupting over dividing the family china after divorce or death. The fights are usually over furniture. Or the dreams of the old family car can continue to haunt long after the car itself was trashed. The family soul includes far more than the few nuclear people of the ad. It includes all that background in the ad. The setting of the TV sitcom, the stairs and the couches and the lamps, is as much part of the family as the characters who crack the jokes. The family household today is a center of consumerism, a hearth where the CD and the TV and the VCR and the PC and so on are all there. And it's an economic unit, but not a psychoeconomic unit. It's neither service nor productive. It's a consuming unit. And the parent today is a consumer manager, a kind of probation officer to whom adolescents are supposed to check in and to get what they're, in order to continue the consuming patterns. A little fact. Of the 301 cultures that have been studied in one of these big anthropological surveys, more than half have extended family systems. That is, families that go beyond just a mother and a father and a son and a daughter. And 84% of the world's cultures, again supposedly, practice or permit polygamy. So that the whole extension of the family and of the people in it is much broader than our notions of it. Family may not so much derive from the bourgeois class's devotion to property and the guarantees afforded by the laws of ownership. Rather, those bourgeois values may themselves derive from the soul of the house and its belongings, asking for permanent structures of caretaking. See, imagine instead that you sit in a room full of dead things. Imagine that those things are part of the family, and they ask for caretaking. Perhaps the propertied class and its laws were created by the need of property for ownership. Things wanting to belong to someone somewhere. The yard sale is an orphanage. Things are begging to be taken in and owned. At least the word familia invites these reflections about the psyche of property, which is very important for us to begin to get the soul out of ourselves and back into the world. We're beginning to do it with ecology, beginning to do it with animals. Maybe we'll get to trees and stones, but will we get to the furniture? But that's a possibility of realizing what it once was in the sense of the soul in things. Various gods and goddesses lived with the ancient family. Vesta at the hearth, the Latin word was focus for hearth, who must be acknowledged first and daily, else the central bonding flame could go out. Janus was at the gates, so that one remembered the different faces required for outside and inside. The three different gods of the doorway, there was a god of the door, a god of the hinges, and a god of the threshold, who prevented bad spirits from entering the domestic interior. Just think about how you come home at night at 5:30 after work. There should be a lot of gods there before you bring in the bad spirits into the house. The Lar or Lares, who were the ever-present and remembered ghosts of the household dead, they were in the house always, the ever-present ghosts of the household dead. And food fallen to the floor at a meal was at once taboo because it now belonged to the familiars of the underworld. It wasn't that it was dirty. Our way of talking about it, because we're Protestants, or the culture's Protestants, is that it's dirty and therefore it's finished, you know. But then if it fell to the floor, it belonged to the underworld figures. And then there were the Penates, or the wee ones of the cupboards, without whom Old Mother Hubbard might not even find a bone. The ancient home gave plenty of space to the invisibles that live in a family, propitiating and domesticating the demons which it acknowledged as rightfully belonging. Above all these was Juno, or Hera in Greece, who presided like a stately, powerful Roman matron over the psychic and material well-being of the household. In Juno was combined instinct and institution. Instinct and institution. Marriage, both as that coupling urge for permanent bonding and as a societal stability. The regular order of life within the household and within the bodies of the women in the household was regulated by the calendar. The first day of each month, the kalends, was dedicated to Juno. Little houses made of clay were devotional objects in her cult, and heroes of myth, the most great classical heroes, were sent on their way in one way or another because of Hera or Juno, were recognized as such not only by their deeds, but also by the trophies they brought back home. And we have the trophy shops in all the airports. And when the businessman hero comes home, he stops in and gets a trophy. Ulysses felt himself a failure because after 20 years' absence, he arrived home unclothed and without trophies. His family, by the way, included his old nurse and his old dog. Again, that emphasis upon ties beyond blood and upon animals and things. Now, what use is family for adult life? Now, we're near the end and we can have a little discussion. Much of what is said about family reflects the viewpoint of the child. Family is neither positive. Well, family is either a nest or a negative cage. Even the political notions of family consider the institution through these same eyes of childhood. The right wing insisting upon its stabilizing, the left on its inhibiting effects. I mean, one of the big contentions is where you are in regard to family. Family is something you leave behind, or family is the good. That's where all the value of the culture is. And that moves into our political debate. In fact, many of the dilemmas we've touched on so far and our own mixed feelings about our families arise because we remain in the perspective of the child, longing for home and rebelling against it. Now we can move this ambivalence by moving out of the childhood view. So what is family then in adult eyes, and what use for adult life? What does it signify for a person past 45 or 50? Where and how does it matter even after the developers have torn down your childhood home and neighborhood, after your parents are buried and lawsuits have split you from your brothers, after psychoanalysis has revealed the corruption, hypocrisy, and exploitation in the family's heart, and even after the family which you yourself may have parented is broken up or so distorted beyond recognition as yours by serial marriages, step-siblings, and vicarious offspring. Now let's try to find some values by extending the notion of family beyond what a child can imagine. Because a great deal of what we say about family is from the point of view of therapy and the therapy of childhood. Well, one thing that's important is imagining family not only as extended, but also vertical. As one ages, interest grows downwards toward descendants and up backwards and outwards towards ancestors. The features and characters of grandchildren and their children. At the same time, interest shifts backwards to forebears, genealogy, where we all came from. There's always one old uncle in the family who's doing the family records. Where we all came from, how we got to settle here, memories and tales, and so on. The stitched and framed sampler of the family tree, the evening with the photograph album, as T.S. Eliot calls those remembrances, dilate the focus of life beyond the solitary and lonely self. Instead, I become a figure in the tapestry, maybe a little bit off to one side, yet ramified into a huge social structure with a part in the history of my region and its people. Here we encounter a Chinese idea of longevity, not merely as an actuarial statistic that announces my life expectancy. Rather, longevity can connote an extended consciousness downward into my children's children and backward to the ancestors. Tribute to them, even our commandment to honor thy father and thy mother, lengthens life. A longevity of imagination embracing centuries. The more we are able to enter the heart and mind of the children's children and the unforgivable shadows in the mindset of our parents and their parents, by understanding the ways in which they perceived and valued the world, we enter history, we extend our span, and we increase longevity. Each child ruled out, each parent cut off, is a lost limb of imagining power and thus shortens life. Each member lost or cut off is also a pain cut off, an anesthetizing of the range of sensitivity, an increase of subjective egotism, a narcissism, and only one's own face is in the painting. It's a matter of extending memory in a funny way. We remember one story. There's a kind of monotheism of memory. My children and I remember the same event, say walking them to school when they were 6 or 7, or a meal or a vacation or something particular, or my mother and I have certain memories, but we don't tell the same story of those events. And this is very hurtful. She remembers it one way, I remember it another way. My son remembers it one way, I remember it another way. There's a clash of stories. Dad never sat down for dinner with us. What do you mean? I always cooked your breakfasts. Clinging to the one story keeps one locked in a polarity. So not hearing all the stories, all the tales, the myths, the fantasies that the others tell about you, whether it's true, has nothing to do with what's true. There isn't any truth in this. We're not talking about truth. We're talking about extending memory. Another useful thing to think about family in older life is nepotism. One ramification of the tree is that vice of influence called nepotism. I have an uncle in the business. My wife's sister works for HUD. Maybe she can do something. Harry owes me one. My father helped his father when he was really down. It doesn't matter how you look, what you can do, where you went to school, or even if. It's enough to be related. And if one must choose between efficiency and loyalty in hiring and firing, then loyalty, blood loyalty first. Only trustworthy, the only trustworthy institution for the immigrants coming into America all through the last century and at the beginning of this century, whether they were from Eastern Europe or Irish or Hispanic or wherever, was the family, was nepotism. That was the institution that gave them security. Much of the world still runs this way. Not only the church of the Renaissance, from which we have the term, or the family as the mafia is called still today. The loyalty of nepotism is neither that of love or friendship. It has nothing to do with personal relations. Instead, this vice teaches the virtue of the primacy of family feeling over any individual member, where family feeling is a code of conduct, a religion even, because it is a commitment to death. Nepotism thus exalts family above all powers on earth. It says no claims of law or love or personal conscience take precedence over family. And that's a pretty shocking thing. The extended family in the south of Italy, for example, is an ideal, a dream of a widespread clan of mutually helpful and protective relatives who work together for the common good and who are held together in a oneness of feeling and organization by the blood relationship which alone can be trusted. There are other things, such as the idea of fame. You know, there's the fantasy, somebody in the family wants somebody else in the family, or is very proud if someone in the family makes it, successful, fame. Now, the Roman idea of fame, or fama, was absolutely crucial because the word fama had to do with brightness, a genius, a bright shiningness. To want fame for a son, we call mother complex or anonymous spirit or God knows what. But the archetypal question is, what is going on behind wanting to have a son or a daughter who is a star? It is to bring into the family pattern, the whole clan, the psyche of this extended thing, downward and backward, that brightness of the other world, to be touched by a star, to have a cosmic significance. Fame was bright, public fame was brightness. And so, on TV, the football player or the boxer says, "Hi, Mom, I made it." And with that little gesture, he's back into the ancient idea of fama, which was very important, was called, then it became reputation. In Shakespeare's time, it was called reputation. And you'll see that word appearing again and again in Shakespeare's plays about reputation. And it has to do with honor. It has to do with a certain quality of lifting from obscurity the darkness of the soul of the collective family. Because obscurity was like poverty, and it meant a tremendous suffering. And if anyone, anywhere in the family achieves success, as we call it, that moves the whole family. And then tales go on much later about having had an uncle who was a general in the Civil War or whatever. Well, I think there are many other little things, but I want to bring this to an end so that we can discuss back and forth. You know, the humor of family is crucial, another thing. Enough has been written about family as fate, and we know an awful lot about these horrors of the house of Atreus and Cain and Abel and Joseph and his brothers and all these family stories. From the Roman Empire through the First World War, the whole history of Western civilization was about families. The houses of Europe were fighting each other, and that was what the wars were about, or that was part of what the wars was about. A succession of murderous rivalries between royal families. It's as if history and mythology is simply family writ large and fatefully. But not necessarily tragically, because even if family is fate, it is also a laugh. The experience of the human comedy, as Balzac called his encompassing series of family novels. Family remains the source of world humor about mother-in-laws, poor relatives, wedding nights, fading minds, and deathbed scenes. Fate cannot be carried without humor, nor can the family. So that perhaps the greatest of all gifts that family offers to adult life is the dignity it grants, even as it pokes fun at the ridiculous plight of old age. Humor here, I do not merely mean telling jokes, making puns and teasing and TV witty comebacks. I mean the droll humor of living together. The humor that is humid, humus, human, the earthy moisture that supports life. We take it also, the therapeutic world takes it also heavy. The whole thing is heavy and has to be fixed. The way old people in theater and in novels and in movies are is not just so heavy. It's full of incredible ridiculousness all the time. Well, I think you know what I mean. And all the best jokes are about that. You know, they say the best thing about Alzheimer's is you can hide your own Easter eggs. See, that's not therapeutic. That's a travesty to talk that way. By extending family towards its fullness of possible meanings, I have tried to remind our highly individualized and rationalized consciousness that profound significance resides in all aspects of family, especially as those that are intolerable and generally condemned. I've tried to show that family is a sustaining institution, not just because of blood ties, procreation, and childbearing, or because it supposedly fosters the virtues of mutual respect and responsiveness, and thence bourgeois respectability and responsibility and all that good stuff, or because it is said to provide the social and economic structures upon which civilized decency depend. You've heard all of that from Mr. Bennett, probably. These are the conventional and literalized meanings of family which have kept its imagination and arguments far too narrow. I've instead been attempting to present family as the actuality of myth, particularly as the supreme metaphor for our life on earth, because it presents that force of human attachment to a dwelling place, of domestication of the savage and the nomad, of honoring the invisible, the demonic and the dead, of making intimate, familiar, and owned the persons, animals, and things of this world, taking them home to the hearth, ourselves as long-term caretakers in bondage to our fate on earth, playing out the comedy of human interiority and human continuity, interiority of bringing it all in. Now, I've been using this very daily subject, family, and what could be more daily and deadly, to demonstrate that what we take most for granted is where myth resides. We encounter myths in the middle of messes. Messes of love, messes of choices, messes of nightmares and symptoms that break down our subjects, not merely displace it, break it down. In all those messes we call reality. So this evening I've been attempting to break down that distinction between myth and reality in order to suggest that myths are always going on because imagination is always going on, and going on most of all in the family when not recognized as such, and least of all perhaps when pronounced and literalized as myth. And nowhere is myth more present or ourselves more immersed in it and blind to it than we're right in the middle of a family thing. Okay, why don't we have some, those, yeah, thank you. So, now, those who have to go home, this is a good time to go home. And those who have to go to the bathroom or have a cigarette or whatever else, it's a good time to do it. And those who want to talk a little while about some of this, this is the time for that. What about the dysfunctional? What about so many families that are dysfunctional with homicide and all these terrible things happening in them? Well, I think that that is part of family. As I say, it's the most dangerous place to be. Our Western myths tell us that. Joseph's brothers tried to put him in the pit. Abraham took his son up the mountain to kill him because God told him to. What about Oedipus and Clytemnestra and all the Greek tragedies? What about Shakespeare's tragedies? Are they not telling us that murder is there in family and in the roles of family? Therapy wants to cure that somehow, or calls it dysfunctional. I prefer to see it as archetypal and tragic and part of it, just as humor is part of it. And it's a place where some of those things are perceived. You see, the notion of dysfunctional, which is now so widespread, it condemns what it's dealing with. What's going on? Never mind, get rid of the idea of dysfunctional. What's going on? My father wants to kill me. I'm afraid to go home. That's what's going on. And that desire to kill the son is archetypal. It's in all the myths, or it's in many myths. And that's a very powerful thing, and it's part of fathering. And there's no use setting up romantic ideals of throwing a baseball back and forth. That factor is there. And I think those are the things that therapy has to take into account. It doesn't have to read statistics as much as it needs to read tragedy. And then comes a sense of the horror, and a sense of the importance of protection of that son, and a sense of, you see, a lot of things come from that. This is a real threat. Because it's part of just as it's part of the mother to smother, and so on. Our ideals make it so much worse because our ideals of how it ought to be continue the suppression of those dark parts. And they become darker because of therapy's ideals. I'm not talking about the individual therapist. I'm talking about the systems of therapy. Please.
I've heard you say that the danger of rejecting the family is falling into narcissism or an identity crisis. I'm wondering if you could speak more about that.
The danger of rejecting the family, you heard me say, is falling into narcissism or an identity crisis. No, about identity crisis, let me make that a little clearer. I said if there's no fantasies for you, if the people around you in the place you live have no fantasies about you when you're growing up, you're not being perceived. They're not noticing whether you do this well or that badly, or what your gifts or talents or stupidities are. If they're not perceiving any of that, if they have no fantasy for you, then you have no niche. So their fantasy is very important. We now call that feeling an identity crisis. But I think it's very important to try to find out what kinds of fantasies people had about you at another time of your life. Now, the second question about narcissism, yes, that was in regard to longevity. If your imagination doesn't extend downward, vertically downward to the children and grandchildren and all of that stuff, and upward or backward to the ancestors, you're left with only you in the picture. Your development. Your self with a big S. And that is a kind of narcissistic notion. You don't fit into a pattern anywhere, into a tribe, into a clan, into history. Anything more?
Is that the end of therapy then?
That's interesting. Let me get it straight. if therapy leads us to independent individuality, is it actually leading us to narcissism? If it becomes rejection of family, well, yes, I think it does, but that's a whole other paper. Yes, I think it does. I think therapy has problems about this, yes. Please.
What is love?
How did we get to that? Go ahead. The question was what? The last part of the question was what is love? The first part of the question was, say it again.
Well, family is the receptacle, the container.
The container. The family is the container.
Of tolerance.
Tolerance, empathy, acceptance.
On the other hand, we tend to associate with people that don't upset us.
On the other hand, we tend to associate with people who don't upset our psychological equilibrium.
Right.
Are you suggesting that the people who don't upset us are therefore more empathetic and more loving?
Not necessarily at all.
No.
That might simply be back-loving.
Or comfort?
Comfort.
Yeah. My suggestion was, I'm not going to try to answer what is love, but why not? I mean, you know, is that the upset that family produces opens the door to much more complicated mythological life because of the intensity of the emotion. And we call those things mother complexes and father complexes and so on. But there must be something more happening than just that, which is a very reductive and simplified way of looking at it. I've been suggesting that it opens the door to what is family itself, and that the ghosts and the ancestors and the demons are there in the house. And those explosions that happen are very significant. But not the personal family in the usual way we try to take it. You know, what we do in therapy with family generally is all a reconstruction. It's about things that happened 30 and 40 years ago. Nobody knows any of it, and half of the people are dead, and it was written in another age. We try to, if you read a novel from 30 or 40 years ago, you're reading it from today. So we're reading our family histories from today, but the way it all went on then was different. It was written in another time by another author. I'm trying to deliteralize the personal notion of family that we have.
The reason I ask is I want to know what to put on my Mother's Day card.
What to put on your Mother's Day card? Say it with flowers. Yeah. The question is the myth of, because there are many cultural differences and there's historical differences in family, in the imagination of family, is there a trend line? Are we going somewhere with family? Well, the sociological statistics and demographic statistics say that families are disappearing. But they're not disappearing in the therapeutic world. That's the curious thing. As the sociological and demographic family disintegrates, family has become the mode of doing therapy. What is therapy doing? And is it not restricting itself to a very certain portion of, or certain class and certain part of the culture, of the national culture? I mean, how do we put those things together? That people are not, more and more people are not living in families, and yet therapy is spending more and more time talking about family systems. You're asking or stating that the family is the shadow of the individual hero. Yes, I tried to say that early on, something like that. Thank you. That makes it clearer. The family is the inevitable shadow of the myth of individual development. Moving out, getting away, leaving the family, going off on your own. I don't need anyone. I'm starting on my own line. So therefore, family is going to carry all that inhibiting, pullback, regressive, restrictive stuff. Yeah. So if we were to use modern deconstructionism or just, see it as a trope, then we'd say, where am I when I dislike my family? I must be in the hero myth. Strong ego, developmental. I'm not codependent. That's why I tried to say earlier on, the job is not working over the family, it's working on that developmental psychology model, that I am the result of my childhood. And my disorders are the result of my childhood. Now, if you think about that from any other culture, I've said this before, but it's worth it. It's worth it again, that in any other culture, if you lose your mind, get sick, have troubles, marriage troubles, or troubles with whatever it is, you can't kill any animals, or the crops aren't working, whatever the troubles are, they're troubles constantly. You look for the witch, you look for the shaman, you try to find out who put a curse on you, you try to find out what taboo you broke, what you ate that you shouldn't have eaten, what tree you cut down that you shouldn't have cut down, who put a pin in a doll, what kind of fire was lit and was lit the wrong way. You look for 100 things. You never think that it's because your mother did something to you 40 years ago or your father. It's only in our culture that we attribute what's wrong with us, in our diseases, in our psychological makeup, in our breakdowns, in everything. We think it's something that happened from... That is our fundamental myth, and it's the myth that sustains therapy. And mom and dad, even if there aren't mom and dad, it'll be somebody else, but it'll have this childhood, and it keeps the archetypal child alive. And the archetypal child is always growing and always needing and always feels abandoned. That's part of the myth of the archetypal child. So it keeps therapy going. Can I say something about my passion working with men's groups nowadays and with Robert Bly? I worked with men's groups for the last 5 years, retreats and days, and I've done it here in New York. Seems to be something needing to be done, and I enjoy doing it. I don't know what else to say. Yeah, please. If a person keeps hearing the parental tapes that say, you're doing it wrong, you're stupid, you should have done it this way, why don't you do it that way, there are better ways than you're doing it, aren't these really the parental tapes that keep playing? Well, I've wondered about that. Suppose we were to drop the notion of the parental tape. Suppose we were to just keep it as a voice that appears and keeps saying these things. I think it would be more useful to imagine it as a voice, as a demon, as an angel, as a ghost, as an invader who comes in when you're beginning to work, comes in the middle of the night at 4 o'clock and sits on the edge of the bed and begins to curse you, or whatever, gives you worry, and to treat it that way than trying to reconstruct your childhood and deal with that voice there and then. And listen to it, first of all. Listen to it once. What exactly is it you're doing that the voice says you're doing wrong? What exactly? Not general, but precisely. Because usually in those voices there is some. When you tie it to your mother or your father, it becomes a blanket thing that you try to get rid of. But if you forget your mother and father and just take the content of what the thing is saying and reduce it to exactly what it is saying, you may learn something. Otherwise, I think you're one gets trapped in fighting the parents and putting yourself in the position of the child. Which is what you want to get out of to begin with. Please.
Saying, this is a terrible screwed up situation, I'm going to straighten this out, and the family's going to be wonderful, everything's going to be restored back to order again. Is that not the archetypal just manifesting itself through not the ideals of the family? The notion of the family can be a wonderful place. It's just part of the archetype manifesting itself as well.
What part is manifested? The idea that of wanting to set it straight? No.
Set it straight. There's going to be this wonderful, nurturing, lovely, great place.
Yes. Yeah. Arthur Miller writes about it. I forget where I read this, but I have it in those. That the family is this kind of notion. There's a notion of family as a wonderful place that gives you long-term support, that's a warm place to come back to, where habits don't change, and so on and so on. That is one of the fantasies of family. It's not the case in many people. It's also, but it's one that's very important, that homecoming idea, homecoming. Yes, that is a deep-rooted fantasy. And part of our bitterness is that my family didn't give me that.
Isn't that more than a fantasy? It seems to be stronger than that.
There's nothing stronger than fantasy. I can't think. You know, Jung said fantasy creates reality every day. Yes, it's an archetypal fantasy. It returns again and again. Yeah. In the back, yes, please. If we go back for Thanksgiving Day dinner or Mother's Day dinner.
Right, and we all regress, and everyone in the family reverts to the same standard creating orders, and it seems impossible to have those reasonable discussions.
And everything becomes ridiculous and impossible to have those reasonable discussions.
And extremely frustrating.
Yeah.
Is there anything that can be done to avoid the anger?
Laugh. It's amazing. Recognition of what's happening. Here it is. Here it is. Here it all is. Because you have to ask yourself, what do you want to happen? What would you like to happen? Would you like to restore what the gentleman in the back said? In other words, a kind of wonderful, wholesome, nurturing thing.
So don't expect that. Then you won't be disappointed.
Well, that's a general one, you know, don't expect it, you won't get disappointed. But what's life without expectations? No, I don't know that. I think...
Don't expect the ideal. Don't expect the warmth and the support if it isn't there. And you just have
Well, also find out why you're going home. I mean, you may not find out. This business of why is ridiculous. We don't know why. But you might have some idea of what you're doing. If you're going home to assuage guilt, you're setting up a lot of demons. If you're going home because you want to see who everybody is this time, or hear some new stories, or something, I mean, that it's, you know, or just to see what happens, or to eat that cake that somebody made that was always good, it's different. But if it goes home with that moral heavy-duty thing, I got to go home, because you're bringing a lot of bad vibes in the door with you. Oh, I didn't say that. That's up to, you know. Yes, please.
I just wanted to ask what family was.
Thank you very much. Now, there's one little point there that helps with what happened there. That was a ritual. There was sacred space owing to the death. And going home for Mother's Day or Thanksgiving also has a ritual aspect, but which we forget and turn into a Hallmark card. But if we could recall that it is actually a ritual, I don't know if Mother's Day is a ritual, that's one invented by Hallmark card or somebody, but Thanksgiving has a certain ritual. And if one remembers that this is taking part in a ritual, that there's another reason for going than personal relatedness. Yeah. Well, there's a deep emotion that can come just from partaking in a ritual. Just showing up. As Woody Allen says, showing up is 80% of life, you know. Please, yeah. Well, that's a good point. I don't, thank you. Why in my wide acceptance of myth do I find it necessary to deny the myth of development? Look, there has to be something you hate, you know. And you have to have a straw man that you can attack all the time so that you can make your points. And as Ortega says, if you're not going to exaggerate, you may as well keep silent. But I hate the myth of development because it is the dominant myth of psychology in our culture. And the myth of development suits the child archetype. It's a product of the child. It's an expression of the child archetype. And I feel that the child archetype has got us by the balls, or got us by I don't know what, in our culture. And Alice Miller is part of that worship of the child, this sort of innocent child to whom is creative and wonderful and terrible things happen to it. And this new hysterical moralism about how many people in the culture are now regarding themselves as abused, and the use of the word abuse and victim and survivor, words that belong really to people who were either in Vietnam or in the Holocaust, are now used about family life. There's something desperate going on. And to me, this is part of the developmental hang-up of psychology. And there's something more to it, because the archetypal child not only always needs therapy because it's always growing and always feels abandoned, but also the child by definition is apolitical. And I think therapy is guilty of something. Therapy, I'm not talking about individual therapists, that's something else. This is the model of thought that we've all been in, the culture has been in. That for the last 20 or 30 years, the most sensitive and intelligent people have been in therapy. They've not been in politics. And they've been engaged with growing their child out of their childhood, or growing and all the rest of the child stuff. And the child keeps you from, you say, what can I do? The child, that's a sentence from the child, what can I do? This thing is bigger than I am. That's a sentence of the child. And then we bitch, we become passive-aggressive, we bitch about the administration or Milken or somebody. We don't regard ourselves as citizens, we regard ourselves as selves, growing selves. And, you know, Aristotle said, defined human being, one of his definitions is, man is by nature a political animal. Not man is by nature a self-developing creature. Man is, or an individuating person. Man is by nature a political animal. It's instinctual to be in the polis, in the community. Which would lead to another definition of self, from self as defined as the interiorization of God, or the divine spark, to the interiorization of community. And I could never find myself unless I were in community. It's a very different notion, and I think that's very important. So that's why I fight this child thing so much. Oh, because of the developmental psychology. And it takes us always backwards. What happened then? Reconstructing. The ancestors. Well, the ancestors open the world. You know the ancestors are dead. You know you're talking myth and fiction when you talk about ancestors. Oh, you don't know that when you're talking about your mother and father. Yeah, lots of questions. Yes, please.
Well, I find what you said therapist.
The question was, I find what you've been saying very evocative and provocative, but I don't, as a therapist, I don't know how to interpret what you've been saying as a therapist. If somebody comes to me bleeding and anxious, and so I don't know, and in distress. For me, what's important is that you are now in distress over what I've been saying. Yes, and if any seed has fallen, or if any rug has been pulled, that's enough. Because it may be that you'll listen differently, or hear something in a new way, or doubt the way you were working, question the theories that you've bought. That's all. I think that's the important thing, is the consciousness of not how to apply a new technique or a new idea, but to let the psyche react differently, freed from the concepts and constructs that we have been using. Not just you, but all of us. Because the imagination finds ways, so does the heart find ways. Yes, we're almost at the end. We'll take a couple more, please.
I'm wondering if you could discuss the difference between fantasies, the idealized image we may have of families, and the mythic thing that you say emerges spontaneously out of the family. What's the difference between fantasy and myth?
No, I won't try to answer that. That's fantasy and myth. But let me get it again. What emerges out of family? What was that again?
What I heard you say is that these...
What do you want to say? Never mind what I said.
The father who wants to kill the son,
Yeah.
that is an attachment to a much bigger issue than that father and that son.
Yes, when the father wants to kill the son, he is enacting or experiencing a mythical, archetypal pattern, power. Okay.
So are there two myths then that are being enacted here? One is the idealized...
Yes, there are many being acted. Many, many, many. One of them is the ideal of a harmonious, loving family. And I think that is the myth that haunts the abandoned child who's been orphaned and put out on the hillside, like Oedipus, like Jesus, like Moses, like Hercules. They were threatened in the cradle, or they were abandoned. That one is longing to go home, to find a home. So the question is, when that is my longing, when my ideal is where is that harmonious home, what myth am I in when I'm looking for that? Am I the abandoned child, who's the shadow of the hero? We got one more, yes. Oh, I have one and one. Okay.
If we accept everything, which I tend to do,
If we accept everything
that you've elaborated today,
that I've elaborated today, wow.
doesn't that tend to make this process a self-fulfilling prophecy, so that we might be tempted to not see things differently, perhaps otherwise than we habitually do?
What would be the self-fulfilling... I'm repeating the question. If I accept everything that you said today, which I tend or would like to do, doesn't this make for a self-fulfilling prophecy? What would be the self-fulfilling prophecy?
Well, that the family structure is inherently destructive.
Oh, no, hold on.
All of that.
Oh, that the family structure is inherently destructive.
Yeah.
I don't think I said that. I said it's inherently mythical. I didn't say it was inherently destructive, but that myths have destruction in them. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that the family pattern is inherently destructive. It is that the family not pattern, the family has many things in it. It's a place of rich mythological fantasying, some pieces of which are destructive, yes. But those destructive patterns need also to be revalued. If the father committed suicide, instead of resenting him your whole life through for being a coward and copping out and all the rest, maybe he opened the door to death where you're going to go too. And maybe he's gone deeper than you can go. And you haven't been willing to see it, and you're willing to call him a coward. Maybe if your father was absent, as everybody bitches about, the absent father, he was never there, he never threw the basketball with me, he never da-da-da, so on and so forth. What is one longing for? And what did that absent father teach one by his absence? Every father, once you've moved out of these bitches and these resentments and these carpings, every father taught something. And the absent father, Keats, who lost his father when he was 8 years old, said, "He who would be creative must create himself." And the absent father shows you what you can do without him. And every one of these fathers, the drunken father, the beating father, every one of them shows something. Once you get out of the idealized idea that there was supposed to have been a good, sweet, nourishing father. And so on. But, yeah.
The title of the talk was given as Extending the Family.
Yes.
And it led one
The title of the talk is Extending the Family.
It led me, I think, to believe that there is an alternative prospect.
An alternative prospect. No, I think the alternative prospect is first the notion of family as a psychoeconomic unit rather than only a kinship unit, so that all kinds of people can live together in service and participation with each other. And also I tried to extend the family in different ways, through extending our notion of family, our fantasy of family, and our idea of family. There was one, yes, in the yellow sweater. The appreciation for the tragedy. We call that ego strength. I don't know what that is. Well, I hear what you're saying, that what I'm asked, first of all, I'm not asking people to do anything, except come to the lecture. What I've raised as a possibility is that one can, as you say, distance or laugh or enter and observe, not get caught. But I drew it very carefully that one does get caught. One goes down the drain. One gets paralyzed. And if one knows that, that's not being distanced and detached. One is going down the drain. The advantage is, the difference is only the difference between here we are going down the drain, rather than saying, God damn it, what's going on? I don't know, why can't I get out of this? And, blaming yourself and fighting it and all, rather than having an image of where you are. And I don't know whether that... See, the problem of ego strength to me always means becoming strong and intact and independent and distanced. It's an Apollonic fantasy, and I'm giving more a Dionysian fantasy of just being in it and having the moments of awareness happen, rather than struggling to keep aware. Oh, it happens. It just happens. Once you go home, it's happened. Okay, it's 10 o'clock. I wish you all a nice Mother's Day.